This evening we got Johnny Van Holt. He's better known as Johnny Liberty. Johnny is the author of the best-selling Reclaim Your Sovereign Citizenship, published by Cascadian, is it, Jim? Cascadian Resource Center. He is a whole system educator, researcher, and network organizer offering a comprehensive and detailed history of law, economics, and policy. He's taught hundreds of seminars across the U.S. of A. for thousands of American citizens from all walks of life. Please join me in welcoming Johnny Liberty. Thank you, Johnny. Yeah, there we go.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight for another Granada Forum. Fortunately, I got here tonight without any incident and wasn't dragged out of my car or any other possible thing that could happen, even though my last trip to California, I did have my car impounded 2 times in 3 days, and I did have a difficult time getting where I was going. But this trip has been without incident. So I thank you, Southern California, for allowing me to get here to address you tonight. I hail out of Oregon, and I'm an Oregon state citizen, a sovereign citizen of the Oregon Republic. Thank you. And I began this work not that long ago, about 3 years ago, and I had attended a workshop of a man who was talking about money and how money systems work. He actually was a black man who had studied the Emancipation Proclamation, who was also an Oregon state citizen. And he began to open my eyes to some of the historical facts that had been neglected and ignored in American history. And it piqued my eyebrows and my interest, and I said, oh, that's very interesting. I want to find out more for myself. And so over the course of the last 3 years, I have participated in in-depth research and study and education, and have synthesized many of the independent researchers that have been involved in this patriot movement for 30 or 40 years. And that's the source of my inspiration and the source of my inspiration and information as well. So I want to acknowledge everyone who has come before me and those who have blazed the trail, many of them who may be sitting in this room right now, who may have been involved in this work much longer than I have. So thank you very much, everybody, for your contribution. Now, tonight, the title of this talk is Reclaiming Your Sovereign Citizenship, and I use that as a broad subject to talk about all kinds of things, including sovereignty, citizenship, American history, and how political, economic, and legal systems actually work. Now, as Ralph had mentioned in the introduction, my background is as a whole systems educator. So what I'm able to do is take very complicated material and articulate it in such a fashion that people can actually understand what is going on. Because most people, unfortunately, not necessarily the people in this room, most people don't have a clue what is happening in this country. That they get most of their information from the media, or they get it from the newspaper or the television, or they learned about such and such in their history books or in their higher education, but unfortunately didn't really get the whole picture. So tonight, I would like to provide an overview of the research and the education that I've discovered over the last 3 years, and present it comprehensively for all of you so that I can inspire you and empower you to take the next step in this whole movement of reclaiming our sovereignty, restoring our citizenship, restoring the republic, and correcting a lot of the problems that we have today in America. So we're going to cover a lot of material tonight. We're going to look at sovereignty and what that is, because what I have discovered is that sovereignty is the key concept around which all political, economic, and legal systems revolve. And we must get a deepening understanding of what sovereignty is in order to embrace the possibilities of rediscovering America, in fact. We're also going to look at citizenship and the distinctions thereof. Now, I'm sure we've had many other speakers here that have addressed these issues, Richard McDonald and the state citizen people. But for those of you who are new, please bear with us. For those who already know, we're going to review these things and the distinctions of citizenship that exist in this country, and how it was 220 years ago, and how the sovereign citizenship has been encroached over that 220-year period, and what historical events happened through the course of our history, where today, in 1995, we wake up and our sovereignty and our citizenship is a memory, a distant memory in most people's minds, except for those who have recently reclaimed it and are once again drawing that line in the sand and placing a limitation upon the government. We're also going to look at political systems and how they actually work. What really goes on in Washington, D.C.? Who really is directing and controlling the United States government, because it isn't the people that you've elected and it isn't the president, but it's the creditors of the United States that actually direct it. And we're going to look and see how it is that the political system is related to the economic system, and from the Federal Reserve Act on up to the present time, and the bankruptcies that we've experienced, and how bankruptcy affects the political system and the legal system. And then we're going to look at the legal system too, and actually how the legal systems operate, what jurisdictions they're operating under, and how we can develop effective strategies to use the courts, to use the administrative processes that we have available to reclaim our rights and defend those rights once we've reclaimed them. So, we're going to begin with sovereignty itself. Sovereignty is the source of authority from which all laws and governments arise. So if you are a sovereign power, and traditionally in the West and in Europe there were two sources of sovereignty. There were the monarchs, which were the kings and the queens, and there was the Pope and the Catholic Church. And both of those were sources of sovereignty. If you were the sovereign, then your word was the law. It was the same as law. So if you decreed something, it was the same as law. And up until modern times, people, the common people, had no remedy or recourse in relationship to the sovereign. It wasn't until the Magna Carta of 1215 and the Petition of Rights of 1618 in England, and they were the first times that the common people actually had recourse and remedy against the decree of the sovereign. So if you were the sovereign, you created the law. And then out of you, out of the sovereign power, you created nation states, and you created governments, you created corporations, you created banks. All of those were created out of the sovereignty itself to serve the sovereignty. And the sovereign powers set up their commercial affairs and their business affairs in trust structures. So the monarch, the king, and the queen of England, for example, set up a sovereign trust out of which the British Empire came. And all the assets and the banks and the nations and parliament were all subject to that trust. And the same is true of many of the other sovereign powers as well. The Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican as the government was created out of the sovereignty of the Pope and the Catholic Church. Now, what's unique here in the United States of America is when this country was settled and founded, many of the people that came over here were settling here to escape from either religious persecution or for political persecution from one of the sovereign powers or one of the governments that were in Europe. And so the people that settled this country did not have high regard for the systems of government or for the traditional sources of sovereignty. And so they were very hesitant to set up a form of government here in the United States of America where they'd have a king, or they would set up a religious leader as the head of state. And so instead of doing that, when they set up this government, they created the sovereign to be the citizen instead of another king. And so built into the American system of law, which begins with the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the American Revolution, which was fought to defend that declaration, and the Treaty of Peace with Great Britain, which was at the conclusion of the American Revolution. That's the foundation of the American system of law, whereby sovereignty is vested in both the citizen and the states. So in order to understand the Constitution, for example, you must understand those instruments first, because the Constitution makes no sense unless you take into consideration that the Constitution was derived from the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Treaty of Peace. And so they have to be seen together. But that's where the principles of sovereignty and the principles that were laid out in the Constitution, which set up the United States government and the U.S. corporation. It was created by the Constitution, but from the sovereignty of we the people. We the people are the sovereigns in the constitutional republic by law. And we have 220 years of the American system of law. We have a track record that has never been replicated in any other country anywhere else in the world. The United States of America is unique in the world. This is an experiment that was 220 years old. Remember, prior to that, there had never been a time when the common people anywhere were sovereign to anybody. They were all subjects, slaves, serfs, indentured, etc., etc. So our experiment in freedom and liberty for the people began here 220 years ago with the creation of the United States of America. And that's what makes it very difficult for the New World Order to come in here and just simply brush us aside and brush aside our freedoms, because we have it built into our heart and soul. And we are not willing to just brush it aside and become willing slaves again. And that is why they are so afraid of the people. Our government is terrified of us, that we would take responsibility for our lives, that we would actually want to live as free people. And that is part of the polarization that exists here in the country today. And we're going to talk a lot more about how all that works and what we can do about it as well, because we are not helpless in all of this. There is much that we can do, much that we have done, much more that we will do to preserve the liberties that we founded this country on 220 years ago. And I believe that we have enough freedom still kindling in the heart and soul of every American that we can rediscover this country once again and put it back on a constitutional republic. And we can do it in short order. Because... Thank you. So we, the people, are the sovereigns. We are the sovereign citizens. We are the sovereign people. And the government was set up to serve the sovereign people. So that is the principle that is central to the way our government works and to the way the political, economic, and legal systems work in every country and every power structure around the world today. Central to every war and every conflict that exists in the world today is the issue of sovereignty. Sovereignty is so key and so important that it is blatantly missing from our vocabulary. It is blatantly missing from our education, even our so-called higher education. It is blatantly missing from law school. It is blatantly missing. You don't hear it talked about in the media, except once. Only once did I ever hear the word sovereignty, and it was during the GATT debates on the floor of Congress for those who were opposed to GATT. And they were saying, but this would compromise the sovereignty of the United States of America, wouldn't it? Yes, it does, indeed. And so do all the other treaties that we have entered into since around 1945, whereby we have transferred the sovereignty of the United States to internationalist organizations. And so, in order to have a sovereign United States of America, there have to be sovereign citizens and sovereign people in sovereign republics in order for that to occur. That's where it begins, with the people. Now, before I get into citizenship and the distinctions thereof, I'm going to illustrate the power structure a little bit, because it's a mystery to most people how this seemingly very complex structure of control actually works. But it's actually very simple. All power structures are derived from sovereignty itself, all of them. In fact, the sovereignty, you could describe it as the invisible part of the power structure. It's invisible to us. We really don't know who all the sovereigns are on the planet today. They keep themselves invisible and hidden from us. But they are the puppeteers, and they are pulling the strings of the visible part of the power structure, which is the part that we see. We see the nation states, we see the transnational corporations, we see the international bankers, we see the internationalist organizations like the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Trilateral Commission, the Council of Foreign Relations. These are all storefronts for the power structure. They're like Hollywood movie sets that all look like they have the power, but if you actually walk in, you'll see that they're really just kind of leaning up on 2x4s, that the power really isn't there either. Wherever the media directs your attention, that's where it ain't happening. If you wonder why our attention is constantly riveted towards Washington, D.C., and what is Bill Clinton having for lunch today, and when is he getting a haircut, it's because power ain't there. It's somewhere else. And so once you understand that that's how the media distracts us and keeps us from seeing what's true, you have to look in the opposite direction almost to find what's really going on. So instead of focusing all our attention on the visible part of the power structure, where the attention needs to be is on the puppeteers themselves, who are the sovereign powers that are behind the scenes of all the nation states, behind the scenes of all the transnational corporations, behind the scenes of the international bankers. And there is a lineage of sovereign structures that go back thousands of years. There's an excellent scholarly work by Alexander Christopher called Pandora's Box. Some of you may have seen this. It traces the genealogy of the power structure back 3,000 years up to present time to see actually where these sovereign power structures ended up here in 1995. And it's very surprising to find out that most of the people that are truly the sovereigns and the families that are actually behind it, you've never heard them before. You've never even heard their name. They're invisible. So, my estimate is today on the planet there are roughly 40 interlapping power structures in the world today that are the sources of these sovereigns. And they're all fighting with each other and wrestling for larger market share of control over the whole planet and the earth right now, and all of the nation states' economic systems and legal systems as well. They're not all one big happy family all getting together, and chumming up. They're fighting with each other for control too. There's European power structures, American power structures, South American, Chinese, Japanese, Russian, a lot of power structures competing. And so who will prevail, we don't know. The cards aren't all on the table yet, and the chips aren't all counted yet. But nonetheless, the principle is the important part here. It's behind the scenes is where you have to look to find where power actually exists in the world today. And then, once the people reclaim their sovereignty and their sovereign citizenship, then we know who we're dealing with, because we're dealing on an equal par with those same power structures that are out there manipulating, controlling everybody else who has taken on a subject or a slave status. So, that's about all I'm going to say about sovereignty right now. We're going to keep coming back to it because, in conclusion, again, sovereignty is the central concept around which all political, economic, and legal systems revolve. That is the issue. Who is going to be the sovereign? Who is going to prevail? Is it going to be the sovereign powers who are the creditors of this government? Or is it going to be we the people, the sovereigns? Which one are going to prevail? That's the question. We are. We shall prevail because there's no empire in history that has ever been able to squash a free people, ever. Maybe for a little duration or a short period of time. They may put the shackles on for a little while. But most of the shackles they have today are psychological shackles, and they're shackles of information where they keep the information from the people. And once we release those shackles and those chains from ourselves and release ourselves from legal slavery, economic slavery, mental slavery, etc., and we liberate ourselves, then we are unstoppable. So that is my vision and my focus, and ours as well for today, and that's where we're going to end up after about 2 hours tonight. And I hope that this will inspire all of us to take the next step to reclaim our sovereignty. So next, I'm going to talk about citizenship and the distinctions thereof, and we're going to review some points in history also, and I hope this will clarify it for people who maybe have just been introduced to this and aren't really clear what a state citizen is versus what is a American national versus what is a sui juris free person. There are some fine line distinctions between these various classifications of free people, and I hope we'll make those clear tonight. Prior to 1868 in this country, there was no such thing as a United States citizen. It did not exist. It wasn't until the 14th Amendment that the U.S. citizen was created as a legal person born or naturalized in the United States. Prior to that, and at the founding of this country, were state citizens. If someone existed as a preamble citizen in the sovereign state of Virginia or New York or Pennsylvania, they considered themselves a Virginia citizen, a New York citizen, a Pennsylvania citizen, etc. They never thought of themselves as United States citizens. Prior to the Civil War and prior to 1868, no one ever referred to themselves as a U.S. citizen. Not even if they resided in the District of Columbia. They still considered themselves citizens of Virginia or New York, etc., etc. So it's a rather new concept, only about 130 so years old. But 220 years ago, firmly founded on those documents of American law that I already mentioned, the sovereignty was vested in the people. And the Treaty of Paris with Great Britain at the conclusion of the American Revolution said quite literally that the people shall have the same prerogative as the king. Now, you don't have to be a genius to figure out what that means. If you're a king or a queen or a sovereign, it means there's no superior authority. There's no one you have to answer to except God and natural law and unalienable rights and all that. The natural law, that you do answer to. But there was no other human government or human being that you answer to as a sovereign or as a sovereign citizen. The American Revolution was fought on, one of the issues was on the issue of land ownership and property ownership. And that at the conclusion of the American Revolution, the American people held the allodial titles to their property. An allodial title is another word for sovereign. If you were a king or a sovereign and you owned a piece of property, you didn't pay taxes to anyone. You didn't have anybody regulate you. There was no building codes. There was no zoning. There was no environmental laws. There was no other encumbrance that could attach to a sovereign property, to an allodial title. An allodial title is superior title. There is no superior title than a land patent. And so when the American Revolution was fought, and the sovereign citizens, who were the white male property owners at the time, they then held their property in allodium. They owned it free and clear and outright, and the king, the prior king, could no longer tax them. But neither could the governments that they created, neither the state or the federal governments. So long as property is held in allodium, there is no superior authority. And that's the principle upon which America was founded, so that free people, sovereign people, could live on a sovereign piece of property. Remember the old saying, a king or a queen, you're like a king or a queen in your own home. You've heard the phrase. Well, that's what they meant. They really meant it quite literally. And being a sovereign meant that you had to act like one, a good one. Not a despot, but a good one. And a good sovereign is responsible for themselves and responsible for their family, responsible for their neighbors, and is respectful to their neighbors, and looks out after the greater community. That's what a good sovereign does. So the principle of sovereignty extends to our behaviors, to our values, to our virtues, to good Christian values as well. And so when the country was founded on those principles, and then those principles were embraced by the system of law and the constitutions that were created, both on the state level and the federal level. So, prior to the Constitution, there were sovereign states that were free and independent states, quite literally. That's what it said in the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. The states were free and independent, and the people were sovereign within those states. The Constitution was created out of the sovereignty of the people to create this 14th entity originally, the United States Corporation, which served as both a corporate enterprise and a national government. It was carved out of a piece of Virginia and the Virginia Company, in fact. There were two corporations that came here when the country was settled, the New England Corporation in the north and the Virginia Company in the south. And it was out of the Virginia Corporation that the United States Corporation was carved out of. Washington, D.C. was carved out of a prior corporation. It was deeded over and made into a separate jurisdiction and a separate country. So when the Constitution was created, there were then 14 countries here in the United States of America, the 13 colonies and the District of Columbia. And the Constitution, what it did was it put limitations upon that 14th country in relationship to the original 13 colonies and the sovereign people. It basically said, look, we're the sovereign people, okay? And these are the sovereign states. We're going to create, through the Constitution, a corporation and a national government to serve the sovereignty. And you have a very limited authority and limited jurisdiction. And anything that we don't spell out in this Constitution and say that you have the power and authority to do, we're going to reserve it to ourselves through the 9th and 10th Amendments. There's nowhere in the Constitution that says that the federal government has health care or education or agriculture or any of these other areas that they have encroached upon our lives. It doesn't spell it out there. Quite literally doesn't say anything about it. And so when the country was founded, it was for very, very limited jurisdiction. It was meant to be limited. And the Constitution was like a federal employee handbook, instructing the federal government what its job description was, and that it could not go beyond its job description, period. And so, the concept, which is a misconception that most Americans have, is that the Constitution gave you rights. Most people think the Constitution is what gave you rights. That's what they teach in school. They teach you that America started with the Constitution. They barely even talk about the Declaration of Independence anymore. They don't even mention it. They just believe that it started with the government, that the government suddenly is the sovereign power and the people aren't the sovereign power, which isn't true. The Constitution didn't give you any rights. You already had all the rights you could possibly use before the Constitution was created. You had unalienable rights. All the government can possibly give you are civil rights. But what the government can giveth you, the government can taketh away. And so it's not an unalienable right, which is one the government can't give you and can't take away. They're natural law, natural rights, common law. The right to walk, to breathe, to travel, to do commerce. All these derive from the common law. And no government can regulate those. That is a paramount distinction here, very important, between an unalienable right and a civil right. Because a sovereign citizen has unalienable rights, not constitutional rights. The most that a U.S. citizen can have are civil rights, which are rights given by the government. Most people aren't aware that U.S. citizens did not have a right to a trial by jury till 1967. If you're a U.S. citizen, you didn't have a right to a trial by jury till 1967. Well, that's strange. I always thought I had a right to a trial by jury. No, you don't. The sovereign people do. The sovereign people have the unalienable rights under the common law and the Bill of Rights, but the U.S. citizens do not. In fact, the U.S. citizens don't have a Constitution or a Bill of Rights at all. The only ones who have a Constitution and a Bill of Rights are the sovereign citizens. Because again, there's this relationship here. It was the sovereign people that created the Constitution. If there are no sovereign people, there is no Constitution. There is no Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is separate from the Constitution. The Constitution is a commercial contract between the states and this corporation. The Bill of Rights was a treaty between the corporation and the sovereign people. If there are no sovereign people, there's no treaty. There's no Bill of Rights. And so all that remains is, for most people, is to pay lip service to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And you hear people taunt them all the time, oh, I've got this, I've got that. But really there isn't any, by law. And these have been adjudicated in the courts, these distinctions that I'm talking about. Who has a Bill of Rights, who doesn't? There are different rights and immunities for a sovereign citizen versus a U.S. citizen. So when was a U.S. citizen created? The U.S. citizen was created by the 14th Amendment in 1868, one of the Reconstruction Amendments after the Civil War. Now, the Civil War was a pivotal point in American history. And most people believe today, as they're teaching, that Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator and all that, it was all about freeing the slaves. That is what we are taught. And although the slaves were freed at the conclusion of the Civil War, it was not from some great ideological or moral purpose that they were freed. It was more of an economic sanction to cripple the South than it was some great moral and ethical purpose. The real purpose for the Civil War, the reason it was fought, it was over the issue of state sovereignty. That's why the Civil War was fought. It was fought because the South, who had not fared well under this constitutional contract, and the federal government that happened to be in place, and the European powers that were influencing the federal government and the industrial North, were preferential to the industries and the commerce of the North and deferential to the South. And so the South said, hey, we're getting the bad end of the deal here. We want to secede from this union. We want to revoke this contract that we created. The states created the Constitution, remember. They wanted to revoke the contract and secede from the union because it wasn't serving them any longer. And then the federal government and the European powers behind that in the North, of course, crushed the state sovereignty and the secession movement of the South. That was why the Civil War was fought. And from that point to the present time, there has been a continual assault upon the sovereignty of the states and the sovereignty of the citizens. And as time has progressed, more and more and more of the sovereign people have become U.S. citizens. More and more of the responsibilities of the states have been transferred to the federal United States, to that little area, that District of Columbia, that 14th country that was created, that only had jurisdiction within the 63 square miles of the District of Columbia, or an unincorporated territory, or any area that it had a federal area or a federal enclave. Any place there existed United States citizens, in fact. So the Constitution did not give you rights. You had rights prior to the Constitution. It simply restated what rights, the unalienable rights that the sovereign people had. The Constitution was a contract between the states and this new corporation, the United States Corporation. And so, from the point of the Civil War to the point of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which I'll talk about when I get into the economic section, there was a long duration of time between that and the Social Security Act. When the 14th Amendment was passed, it was passed for the newly freed black slaves. Because the country was racially divided during the Civil War, prior to the Civil War, and since the Civil War, around the issue of whether or not blacks were going to be given full sovereign rights. Citizenship was determined by the states, not by the federal government. Every state had and still has the power to naturalize citizens directly through the superior courts. Ex parte Frank Knowles here is the Supreme Court precedent for that. And in the state constitutions, it delineated what a citizen was. A citizen was a white male, basically, in most of the states. And so there were great debates about whether or not the newly freed black slaves were going to be given the unalienable rights of the sovereign people, or whether they were even going to be given freeman status within the states. And because most of the states were unwilling to do that, all of them but two, New York and Pennsylvania, were both willing to grant the newly freed black slaves full sovereign status. The federal government and the European powers behind it saw this as an opportunity to wrestle the sovereignty away from the states and the citizens, and saw the 14th Amendment as an opportunity to begin the long road of encroachment, and thus granted United States citizenship to the newly freed black slaves, and granted them civil rights and protection of the federal government. But again, they got civil rights, not unalienable rights. They know they got a bad deal. They didn't get the unalienable rights, they just got civil rights. There were two parts of the 14th Amendment. The first part was a person is a legal fiction. A U.S. citizen is a legal fiction like a corporation or a trust is. It's just created. It doesn't represent, it doesn't mean an actual live individual human being. That's not the person that they're talking about in the 14th Amendment. But they created a U.S. citizen, a fictitious citizen. The U.S. citizen isn't a citizen at all, because a corporation can't have citizens. A corporation can only have franchisees. That's why they call it the Franchise Tax Board here in California, because if you're a U.S. citizen or a resident, you're a franchisee of the state of California corporation, and thus you're subject to the income tax, and you have to give back to the corporation that gave you something. And what the newly freed black slaves and U.S. citizens had to give back in order to get protection and so-called benefits from the federal government was they had to give up their unalienable rights. In fact, they had to become property of the federal government. The birth certificate was created for the children of the newly freed black slaves. Anybody here got a birth certificate still? You're a black slave. They were created for the black slaves. It enrolled the black slaves' children as property of the federal United States. When you get a birth certificate, you become property of the federal United States. Your birth certificate is transferred to the Bureau of Census, to the Department of Commerce. You are enrolled as a beneficiary of the Federal Reserve System, and you become obligated to the national and federal debts. That's one of the foundational instruments, one of the adhesion contracts, we call them. And so, from the point of the 14th Amendment, the second part of the 14th Amendment, which people aren't aware of, is that it says that no citizen shall question the debt, which established the precedent whereby if you became a U.S. citizen, you no longer could question the federal government's spending. You just became obligated, carte blanche, to whatever shopping spree the federal government was up to. And so from the 14th Amendment on through till about 1933, after the Great Depression, that's when most white Americans began to transfer their citizenship over to the federal United States. After 3 or 4 years of the hardships of the Great Depression, people were very demoralized. And so when they enrolled in the Social Security system to get a benefit from the government, unknown to them in the SS-5, is that when they asked the simple little question on the form, are you a U.S. citizen, and you checked the box, you just gave up your unalienable rights, you gave up your sovereign citizenship, you gave up your Constitution, you gave up your Bill of Rights, and you gave up your country. All because you didn't know there was a distinction between a sovereign state citizen and a U.S. citizen. And so when you got a Social Security number, that was the beginning of a long road of giving up and waiving your rights and become a subject of the federal government. Driver's licenses, vehicle registrations, marriage licenses, incorporation papers, business licenses are all adhesion contracts. And in each one of those you give up another piece of your rights. And in the end you have nothing. You have no rights, not even to control what you do with your body. They want to tell you what to do with your body. Jimmy Carter transferred all the birth certificates as collateral against the national debt to the international bankers when he was president. They took your birth certificate as a security and a trust instrument that it is, and gave it to the international bankers as collateral so they could borrow more money. So your labor, your effort, your work, all of your life will never belong to you. And so, these are the paramount distinctions of citizenship between the sovereign state citizen and the United States citizen. The United States citizen is a legal fiction, a subject of a corporation, subject to all the laws and rules and regulations and acts of Congresses and executive orders, and to the debt. However unpayable it is, you're subject to it. It's an unpayable debt. Can't be paid. All the lip service about balancing the budget, it cannot be paid. It is unsustainable. There was never any provision in the Federal Reserve Act for ever paying the principal. Ever. It was a very well-conceived plan to not only take the sovereignty from the people, but to take all their property as well. And we consented. We consented because we didn't know, because we were ignorant, maybe we were afraid, maybe we were distracted, maybe we weren't paying attention, maybe we weren't being ever vigilant, maybe we weren't watching. And so, now that we know what has occurred, we can now take steps to remedy that. We can take steps to reclaim our sovereign citizenship. There are a lot of things that you can do. Now, I don't expect everybody to run out here tomorrow and go file your affidavits and burn your driver's license and all that stuff. There's probably a number of people here who have already done that. But maybe for those of you who are new to some of this, maybe it'll be the first step on a road and a path back to freedom and back to sovereignty and back to restoring the constitutional republic that we have. Because we don't have a constitutional republic unless they're sovereign citizens. You don't have Second Amendment rights to bear arms unless you're a sovereign citizen. Because there is no Second Amendment unless you're a sovereign citizen by law. None of the amendments apply unless you're a sovereign citizen. Now, whether you become a sovereign state citizen of a particular state, the state citizenship movement is about picking and choosing one of the several states and working within the legal structure of that state in which provisions are there to recognize the common law citizens of California or Oregon. Even in the Motor Vehicle Code, Section 290, the common law, the property of common law citizens are exempt from the Motor Vehicle Code. They had to build in these distinctions in the law. The things I'm talking about tonight are not the rantings and ravings of some crazy conspiracy theory, but these are all in the public record. It's in the law. They're in the United States codes. They're in the California codes. They're in the congressional records. They're in the treaties. They're there to be seen. It's just that not too many people actually read those things, and they don't make it real easy to find. And so unless you enjoy doing that kind of research and poring over the old law books, you might not find these things. But fortunately, there are a lot of people out there who enjoy doing that and have enjoyed it for quite some time. And now we've pulled together a lot of the research of most of those people. I put it together in a book called Reclaiming Your Sovereign Citizenship, so you can have it all between pages of about 250 pages, so you don't have to spend the next 40 years doing the research. You could probably read it all in 2 days and at least get enough background so that you could begin to walk on that path of sovereignty without reinventing the wheel. So we need to reclaim our sovereign citizenship in order to get our country back. And the state citizenship movement is one of the approaches where you choose one of the states. There's also a classification, I'll call it, called the American National. Now, an American National is one who has not chosen any of the several states in particular, but is in fact a non-resident alien, American National. On the USA passport applications, you will notice on the back that the USA passport is for both American nationals and United States citizens. The American national is the non-resident alien, or the state citizen, or the American national, the free sovereign person, people that they're talking about. And you don't need a Social Security number to get a passport. You don't even need a birth certificate if you have other hospital certifications or affidavits of live birth in lieu of your birth certificate. You can still get a USA passport, which is a legitimate function of the national government still. It's a United States of America passport, not a federal United States passport. So from the Social Security Act on up to present time, people have, through many, many adhesion contracts, given up their sovereign citizenship and become U.S. citizens. And in order to reclaim your sovereign citizenship, the first thing that you need to do is to revoke all the contracts you've entered into with the government, whereby you have revoked your rights, your citizenship, etc. And that's why I say not everybody's going to run out of here tomorrow and do it, because you may have to rearrange your affairs a little bit. You may have to do things a little differently. You may have to do business a little bit differently. Now, you'll be able to do business. You'll be able to do everything you can do now, only do it as a free person instead, and a person who has the sovereign powers of a sovereign citizen. But it may take a little time getting adjusted to it and getting used to it. So take your time. Take the time that it takes to study and to learn for yourself and to choose for yourself. And then be prepared to defend those rights once you've reclaimed them. Because the government isn't all that willing to see the sovereignty be restored to the people at this point. They're all too happy right now to be the masters. But somebody's got to step forward and draw the line in the sand and tell the government to go back to the limited authority and jurisdiction that the Constitution laid out for you. And quite frankly, the more the merrier. If there's only one person on that line, it's going to be a lot harder to hold the line back than if there's 10 million people on that line. And right now, there are anywhere between 500,000 and 1 million people reclaiming their sovereignty in this country, and they are afraid to death of that. And because we live in the communications revolution, you cannot keep it a secret any longer. Because we are all inter-networked, and we're surfing the internet, and we're videoing, and we're autoing, and we're publishing books, and we're telling each other. You cannot suppress the truth. You cannot do it. They cannot succeed, though they will try. And they will pass counterterrorism bills, and they'll pass bills till they're blue in the face. But those don't apply to me. The executive orders don't apply to me. Acts of Congress don't apply to me, unless they're prefixed with an H. If it's prefixed with an H, then they're wearing the hat of the national government. If it's prefixed with an HR, it's for the corporation, which is only for the U.S. citizens. That's the distinction between when your senators and your congressmen are wearing the hat of the national government or wearing the hat of the federal corporation. When they went bankrupt in 1933, they went bankrupt for all the U.S. citizens, not the sovereign citizens. But unfortunately, the sovereign citizens turned in their gold just like everybody else and figured, well, this is the patriotic thing to do. They believed that at that time because they didn't know any better. So if you want the government to go away, make them obsolete. And restore the institutions that we do have available, the jural societies, the constitutional republics, those things we have. We have the American system of law right here at our disposal. It's there. They haven't revoked it. They haven't repealed it. They haven't even deleted the sections that they ought to be deleting. But there's too many law books out there, and it'd be pretty hard to rip out all the pages that were pertinent to us. Plus, it's all available on CD-ROM as well. So, don't be afraid to use these tools that we have available here, because this is what we've got going for us. In the last 3 years, I have watched rooms of people where nobody knew what the heck I was talking about. They had never heard any of it before, to rooms full of people that have heard bits and pieces of it, and lots of people who've heard a lot about it, and a lot of people who are taking a lot of action about it. And that's only in the course of a couple years that has happened. I think perhaps for the first time in history that all the pieces of the puzzle are there. We can see the whole thing transparently now. And by the end of this evening, I hope you'll all see it as transparently as I do, and how all these different things relate. The sovereignty, the citizenship, and now we're going to talk about politics, economics, and law, and you're going to see how all those systems relate. And then you're going to see transparently that they only have one agenda. There's only one agenda. It's very simple. They just want to control the world. It's very simple. And they're using every means at their disposal. Political means, economic means, legal means, military means, police means, media, propaganda, deception, distraction, demoralization, terrorism, whatever. And so we have to be better prepared, better educated, develop better strategies than they do. And that's what will make the difference. Strategic planning from a citizen's point of view. And use all the tools that we have available to communicate it broadly. Because the cat's out of the bag. And there's no way they're going to stuff it back in the bag again. There aren't enough concentration camps in this country to suppress it. There are not enough military forces on this entire planet to suppress this country. Look. Just look at how much firepower was directed at Iraq. All of the Western power structures directed their mighty firepower on this one small little country. That was it. That was the big show. That's all they've got to show. This country is far too decentralized, far too rural, far too independent. They could never take it by military means. The only way they can take it is by psychological warfare and psychological means where they convince you that you're slaves and you volunteer into it and you consent to it. And that has been their strategy from day one, because they knew they could never invade this country militarily and succeed. There's too many people that have guns still. And even in their own Gallup poll, which I was surprised at, and Gallup had polled the people here during the aftermath in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombings, that there were 70 million Americans that were willing to take up arms against their government, if necessary, to defend their rights. That's pretty amazing. Now, I'm not an advocate of violence, and I'm not an advocate of war as the first resort. I'm an advocate of using all the other tools we have available, including the legal system and the communication system and the community systems that we have available. That's our first line of defense and offense in all of this. That we might even win this thing without firing a single shot if we develop the strategies that can work in the midst of that. That would be a great revolution. As we all know, in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing, there's been a lot of talking about and raising of some of the issues, and slanting and distorting of the issues as well. But there is an opportunity here for reform that didn't exist before. And I commiserate with the tragedy for the victims of the bombing and all the possible scenarios of who done it and how it actually happened, and whether it was an extremist faction of the militia, which I doubt very seriously, whether the federal government bombed it, whether the Japanese bombed it. There are all kinds of different scenarios here that have been postulated with various affidavits and evidence to support various points of view. And I'm not at the point where I'm going to make a conclusion about any of that. I'm going to reserve judgment for a while until there's a few more chips in a row. But it's very interesting to watch the media spin and to watch also our reaction too. And I suggest that we be considerate in what we take on as fact and what we take on as speculation with regards to it all. Because it doesn't help our cause to speculate falsely and to spread false rumors about things that we really don't have substantial evidence for. Let's wait to see all the evidence, and then we'll bring forth the appropriate indictments. But until that time, it's better to reserve judgment.